Hello there. Hey, it's Tom Fournier here with Chris. We're doing a recording, and we've come across our guest today, Matt Taylor. We've seen he has a book coming out. I guess it's been released in some parts of the world, but it's soon to be released in Canada, called Black Redcoats, looking at a unique aspect of the War of 1812. So we were starting to chat about this and thought, well, we might as well get the recording going because this will probably be of interest to a lot of people. So, Matt, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, your interest in history, and how you come to look at this unique aspect of the War of 1812.
Oh, thank you, and great to be with you. Yeah, it is a bit of a peculiar story in some ways. I'm like a lot of people, I'm quite a history kind of geek. I enjoy reading history quite wildly. Really fell down the World War II hole for most of my history reading. But in more recent years, I've started branching out just because you can only read about the Luftwaffe so many times. Uh, uh, but what happened with the Colonial Marines in the War of 1812 for me was quite a peculiar one. Like I suspect the vast majority of British people with even a vague historical knowledge, I was dimly aware of the War of 1812 as that one in which we burnt down the White House. And that's pretty much the only thing that kind of retains any memory in the British history consciousness, such as it is. And however, in my real life, my real world life, I'm a politics person. I work in politics and have done for a long time. And an aspect of the current kind of discourse in politics across a lot of the Western world, the United States most notably, but also here, is talking about the relationship between the modern the modern ideas of nations like the United Kingdom, the United States, and the relationship between them as what you might call a white construction, a Anglo-Saxon cultural construction, and how
Yeah.
that relates to the non-white peoples who are connected to us via immigration, or in the British case, our imperial history. And that means I spend a lot of time looking at all these connections and the various arguments and discourses around them. And just by accident, more or less. I mean, I believe it or not, I think the film Aliens has a part to play here. Colonial Marines are the Marines from the film Aliens. And one day, while talking to a mate of mine, I Googled around to find like a GIF from Aliens and spotted a picture and thought, that's interesting, I better check that out later. And I went back, and the core element that caught my eye, and it's something I imagine we'll talk about in more detail later, is the Colonial Marines, the British Colonial Marines, the Black Redcoats of my book. When there was a point at which they fought against the United States under the Union Jack, under my flag, the British flag, and that combat was the largest single act of armed African American resistance to slavery, slavery, and it took place under the British flag. It took place because of the British flags, as we'll probably talk about in a little more detail. And it was unknown to me, and I've went around. It's pretty much unknown to everybody in the British sphere. And I'm the kind of romantic sentimentalist about my Britishness and the idea that Britishness is a corporate identity. It's not an ethnic identity, as you might be able to argue English or Scottish or Welsh or is. Britishness is an identity that anyone can become. And this really caught my eye as an amazing example of that. And the fact that we, the British, were unaware of it felt like something of an injustice. And I looked into it further, and the more and more I looked into it, the more incredible and amazing this story became in so many ways. And then I hit upon, as I was digging through, I hit upon this central strategic element to this story in relation to the War of 1812, which I think is undervalued, or at least generally underappreciated, which is the argument I make in my book about the contribution of African Americans to the British campaign in the Chesapeake in particular, but also off the coast of Georgia and in North Florida. And I believe that when you synthesize all these theaters together, you get this broad sweep strategic impact, which is just generally speaking underregarded. And then I was filled with kind of this nationalistic desire to draw it further forward and bring more attention to it. Though, of course, as no doubt we'll probably discuss, it means again, that jingoism can only take you so far, because you have to also engage with the vexed and difficult history of slavery in the American and the British context, because this, of course, is a stirring tale of emancipation, but still under the cloak of both the Republic of the United States and the Imperial Empire of the United Kingdom, both still being slave-holding societies at the time, which is a complexity and a hypocrisy on the British part in particular that is remarkably interesting and intellectually stimulating, and I think throws really interesting ideas about the nature of this history and its ongoing effect forward.
So, it's for Canadians, maybe more better versed in the War of 1812. I still think a lot don't know a whole lot about the Colonial Marines. So that this would be fascinating in that regard. And then here, a bit of a fun fact for you. At the time of the War of 1812, there were slaves in Upper Canada. So a lot of them were um, sort of grandfathered in. Like they came with the loyalists that were fleeing the revolution in the U.S. and these people continue to be held in captivity. Although at a certain point, I believe, Chris, their children were born free, or upon reaching adulthood, they were free.
Yeah, so that's in Upper Canada, right?
Yeah.
Because of Simcoe. Yeah, so their children would be free. I think it was at 21. But then, of course, the entirety of the slavery wasn't abolished until the 1830s in all the British dominions or all the British colonies. So, yeah, very very fascinating, sort of staggered approach, and like you say, very hypocritical. But again, I mean, maybe we can talk about this later, but certainly very similar in the Revolution, very similar in the American Revolution, a very similar mindset of this sort of two sides to this issue. Sorry, carry on, Tom.
No, sorry. I mean, yeah, but just to throw in, actually, I mean, I guess it like links into another thing about how, say, the history of the end of slavery in South America is very similar to that. I think Brazil, Brazil had a no children could be born slaves, and it had a retirement age. You got to a certain age, you stopped being, before they went for full emancipation. So for a lot, these kind of step-by-step systems. I mean, of course, in the British Empire, I think only Antigua and Bermuda released people to full freedom on day one. Everyone else got stuck in apprenticeships, essentially indentured labor, for a couple of years after, which is again a whole interesting thing I couldn't go into later, but we'll get
there. We got a lot to cover off with the subject of Colonial Marines. So
I know, right?
All right. So how did they come into being? You mentioned the Chesapeake area. What year did they start? Who's
Let's say yes. Let's give the wider context. So the War of 1812 begins with a remarkably unsuccessful series of offensives by a surprisingly unprepared United States. One of the core elements of the War of 1812 is, of course, that it wasn't a national project on the part of the United States. It was very much a partisan project by a faction within American politics. So, which they, in a very kind of modern political way, where this faction gained control of all the necessary levers at federal level to launch a war, despite a significant portion of the population, whole states, not wanting to really be involved. Because this meant that the United States launched into this war with a very limited constabulary army, which they hoped to back up with militia filled with complete the revolution nationalist fervor, which really didn't happen. So these American attacks on Canada in 1812 caused quite some damage, caused a lot of concern, because Canada itself was significantly undefended, because the British Empire was currently involved in this massive global conflict against a well-known French dictator. The attacks on Canada didn't have amazing success on the part of the United States, but the British didn't really have any meaningful way to respond and were largely saw it as a sideshow. So we fell back on what we're good at. The Royal Navy has global naval domination, challenged here and there by French ships and privateers and so on. But realistically, anywhere that can be touched by the ocean, British forces can reach. And the Chesapeake Bay area, which Virginia and Maryland mainly look out onto, is it's an inland sea. See, if you get a fleet into the Chesapeake Bay, you're protected from the worst conditions of the Atlantic, and you've got lots of small islands with water sources and a whole array of different options for landing areas around you, which means that your fleet can basically stay there as long as you're able to loot the necessary supplies to keep those ships fed, watered, and the ships themselves in relatively good nick. Though, of course, if you need to send a ship out, you've got Bermuda and Halifax as your big dockyards. So the British sent a fleet in 1813, early 1813, and we began a series of essentially terror raids. One way of thinking about the Chesapeake campaign is as a punitive campaign, a quasi-Victorian or a ahead of time Victorian campaign. It's about sending a military force into enemy territory, wrecking it, causing chaos, to demonstrate that fighting against us isn't worth it. We'll be able to do more damage to you. It's not about taking land or random. It's about forcing a political change on the enemy's part by terror.
And it was also somewhat diversionary, right? So the Governor General of British North America, Sir George Prevost, was petitioning the Admiralty to exert pressure on other parts of the U.S. to dampen their enthusiasm, but also tie down some of their troops so they weren't continuously being sent on attacks on Canada. So
that's indeed correct. Yeah, there was a hope it would be diversionary. I mean, ironically, it was not so diversionary because the United States had so limited military resources available to it. There was very little to divert, which is one of the great ironies of this war. But after the fleet arrived I think in February 1813, and we began the series of raids, the British forces fell into the same traps of the American Revolution. This is the territory that United States citizens of the United States know better than we do. So you can only operate in a very narrow, literal zone before you're at the mercy of militia ambushes, the terrain itself being generally thick woodland, which isn't great for standard military tactics of the era and so on. But within weeks of arrival, the fleet arrived in mid-February, and I believe the first African Americans who escaped from slavery and made it to the British forces were in about early March. I think HMS Victorious was the first to pick up some African Americans who were taking their chance to basically see what happened if they came to the British forces. The African Americans who came to us in those initial stages instantly provided essential intelligence, which made military operations significantly more effective. In the first instance, we now have a source of direct primary information about the resources of the area around us, allowing more targeted raids to keep the fleet supplied, which allows the fleet to maintain strength in the region longer and longer. But we've also got information about militia movements. We've got information about the political leanings of local people and their relationship to the war. And this is all largely coming in the first instance via escaped African Americans. Though later, as British power increases in the region, lots of white Americans would also turn informer, largely because of their helplessness in the face of the military force that was in their local vicinity.
And some of it, wasn't it? If a community was viewed as resisting the British presence, then they would kind of get smacked around. But if a community was cooperative, surrendered its stores, provided foodstuffs, and then they would sort of get bypassed, right? So
that's correct indeed. And again, because thanks to the intelligence provided by America's free press, which obviously British forces had relatively easy access to. We were very aware of the partisan dimension in this war in American culture. So there was also a deliberate effort in a way to widen that gap. So if someone was cooperative, they weren't just left alone. Very often they were paid, they were treated well, and in several instances, you get the situation where communities kind of turn on each other, where one guy fires a gun at the Brits, so the town gets burnt down, but everyone blames him. If you get what I mean, the invading force is is regarded almost like bad weather you've somehow called in, while on the American part, the Americans fell into this kind of habit of assuming that any town that didn't resist was kind of a violently treacherous community that didn't truly believe in the nation, if you see what I mean. When you're more or less completely defenseless in the face of this military force, it's 50-50 which option you decide to go for. Do you fight or do you fight or do you cooperate? These are decisions that people in war zones have to make all the time, and there's very rarely a right answer.
Yeah. All right, so you're starting to get the precedence of slaves escaping to the British. At what point do the British decide, and I presume this is the Royal Navy making these decisions, that there could be a military use for these slaves and turn them against the Americans?
Well, throughout 1813, operational effectiveness is automatically increased by the intelligence brought by escaped enslaved people, but then individual escaped enslaved people are actively taking part in the military operations themselves. So we have several enslaved people who became pilots for naval ships directing larger ships than we might have anticipated up creeks and rivers which we didn't know, we hadn't had the chance to sound yet. But you also had individual enslaved people who would gladly lead British military forces to their own farms and plantations to collect supplies which they could direct you to. And within this, we also have the beginning of one of the cooler, kind of more righteous parts of the story, which is where individuals would escape to the British, then return with British forces to liberate their wider families, which is a genuinely kind of one of the more powerful emotional moments of this whole story. But after that first year of 1813, we went into the quiet winter period, and it was in that period, I think, where the idea gestated. And you're right, it's the Royal Navy commanders, Admiral Cockburn and Admiral Cochrane. They're very aware that they're operating with a very limited amount of forces. They're a secondary show because the European theatre is still in full swing, and they're a secondary show of a secondary show because the Canadian border is the crucial area. But they realize relatively quickly, and there's an interesting aspect here in that Admiral Cochrane was himself a slave owner. He had a plantation on Trinidad, and he'd previously been naval commander for the Leeward Islands in the Caribbean, which are almost entirely slave islands. So he was very intimately linked with slave societies and slave economies. So he understood their weaknesses. And I believe that was one of the elements that pushed him to the idea that not only are these enslaved people, by leaving their masters, they're denuding the Americans of economic power. They're also providing us this direct military support. But if we choose to follow in the footsteps of Dunmore in the American Revolution and Clinton and so on, if we choose to arm them and formalize them as a red-coated part of the British military establishment, the psychological impact on the slave-holding society of Virginia and Maryland will be hundreds of times greater than the sum of the individual military, the individual armed men themselves. And in this, in my opinion, he was entirely correct. All slave societies are they're precarious security societies. You have to maintain a constant security terror on the enslaved people to maintain their position. It's virtually impossible to do that if there is a third party force in the region offering them freedom and offering them weapons with which to resist. And also a slight a kind of inter-services element here, where the enslaved people who joined the British forces became part of the Royal Marine establishment, which means that they're part of the Royal Navy command structure, not part of the British Army command structure when more British Army forces would arrive later, which by increasing the weight of the Royal Navy's landing forces in relation to the British Army forces, it increased the capacity of the Royal Navy commanders to direct operations on land as well as at sea, if you see what I mean, because we're contributing a proportionally larger part of the force on land.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always been my understanding the Royal Marines are part of the naval establishment, right? And not connected to the British Army. So I thought, and you answered the question, Colonial Marines then were an aspect of the British Navy or Royal Navy. Now, how did they structure them, like in terms of officers, NCOs? Were they taken from the Royal Marines, or did people rise kind of up through the ranks within the Colonial Marines? And I ask because there was something similar in Upper Canada in 1812. There was a colored corps of troops, that fought at Queenston Heights, but they were commanded by white officers. So it's and then afterwards, then they kind of became artificers. Like they mostly did construction projects and stuff like that. So for the Colonial Marines, how were they officered? Who were the NCOs that helped manage them?
Well, initially, just to take us back a little bit, and initially, the idea sent by the proposal for how to use enslaved people in the military campaign sent from London was to induct them into the West Indies regiments, part of the British Army. But for various reasons, I think partially because of inter-services stuff, but also because the West Indies officers didn't arrive until relatively late. They were the enslaved African Americans were recruited as Royal Marines. They were organized into their own companies of about 100 men, or most of the time probably less. Each of those companies was officered at commission level by a white Royal Marine officer, though eventually a single West Indies Regiment officer was also temporarily put in charge of them as well. When he arrived, he failed to recruit anybody at the West Indies regiments for various reasons, but he was given direct authority over some. And these companies were also several of these companies were also eventually directly integrated into the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Marines in the Chesapeake. So that battalion briefly became known as the 3rd Battalion Royal and Colonial Marines, because it had several companies of white Marines, then these companies of black American Royal Marines. Within the companies, though, their NCO cadres were from the African Americans themselves.
Oh,
So
cool.
several were made sergeants and corporals. And there's an interesting element here in that as best we can tell, it very much best I can tell from the information we've got, it was very much a case of, it was almost while lots of this story is inevitably colored by racial issues, in regards to their NCOs, it was very much a merit-based and motivation-based promotion.
Was there
The 30 or so,
was there an educational component, like in the British Army, like to become a corporal or a sergeant? You had to be able to read and write, which wasn't the norm for the majority of the troops. And in fact, as the Napoleonic Wars went on, one of the senior warrants was a schoolmaster sergeant. So that helped educate the children with the regiment, but also those privates aspiring for promotion. To teach them basic reading and writing. So.
That's an interesting observation. I don't have anything solid on, but based on the stuff I do have, I would say that is almost certainly a requirement. Oh, the vast majority of the NCOs went on to later civil roles in their post-war life, which I don't think would have been possible without reading or writing.
Yeah, and then an unfortunate aspect of any kind of military establishment is paperwork. So then they're going to have,
Yeah.
daily returns and monthly returns and we're working with the pay lists, et cetera. So yeah.
Well, as I say, I mean, one element that I did spot was of the, I think, 30 or so original Marines, there was, I think, 38 Marines were the first group on the 18th of May 1814 when the unit was formally created. I think of those 38, well over half of them became NCO corporals by the end of the conflict, and a large number of them were still in the unit as officers, and a few as regulars. And again, that kind of indicates to me there was some kind of progression system, and I can't imagine any strong reason to have lessened the requirements in that regard, particularly when you had quite a relatively large number of people to work with, so you could very easily find the most capable. And if they were up for it, I mean, and again, the motivational aspect of this unit is it's almost it's very hard to understate. The vast majority of the African Americans who escaped American slavery to the British forces did not take on direct military roles, including fit young men. The ones who ended up the Colonial Marines volunteered for that service, so they have a motivational aspect to them above and beyond in many ways many of the regular British soldiers and Marines around them, who were, in many cases, were pressed men and so on.
So what happened to those that escaped but chose not to enter the military establishment?
We create the British force in the Chesapeake created essentially a pipeline of gradually, originally massing the vast majority of refugees, as they became known, the Black refugees, on Tangier Island, which is roughly in the center of the Chesapeake Bay. It's Virginia. It's part of the state of Virginia. That island was far enough away from all the coasts that it was taken over by British forces and was essentially inviolable to American attack. The barracks were built there at which refugees were housed. Many refugees were put to work in kind of secondary roles, water carrying, woodwork, washing, mending, stuff like that. But as and when British military need dictated it, so when a ship would sail back to Halifax for repairs, a number of refugees from the island would go at that point. And they were gradually, as almost in the first instance, almost entirely taken up to Halifax, and indeed the vast majority of your modern Afro-Canadian Nova Scotians probably have some connection to this movement of people, and there was some thousands moved out that way. And there's an interesting argument here about how did this happen. And in some ways, it might be because this was a secondary conflict, and orders from London were usually quite vague. We've got a much bigger war going on. Kind of do what you need to do. The orders from London regarding Black refugees were written by the Earl Bathurst, who was Secretary of State for War in the colonies, and this is before the era of what we now understand to be cabinet government and things like this. So in many ways, this was entirely his initiative, and he just said, well, if they come to us, we need to take them as free people somewhere. And I mean, one of the to my modern eyes quite amusing aspects of this, he wrote to the officers in the Chesapeake, try not to bring out too many refugees, because all these refugees, once they're in our hands, they become our responsibility, and our government has a moral obligation to look after them, and that costs public money, man. So don't go bringing too many in, because it'll cost a lot.
or divert essential supplies from military needs to feeding refugees, right? Similar happened in Upper Canada with a lot of the indigenous nations, that fled the Ohio area and came to Upper Canada, and then they talked about how in the Amherstburg area they kind of were consuming all the military stores and wiping out a lot of the local settlers too and their supplies. Interesting.
Yes. Hmm.
So how did they go about training them? Did you have information on that? Like was it done on the fly, or did they set up some kind of like a training encampment and bring their
Yeah,
skill level up?
there was, yeah, on Tangier Island was definitively a training establishment of some kind. Just inferring from the information I do have, it looks like they were put through roughly a month of training of some kind, which I assume included various drills and so on and so on, before seeing combat. So on average, that seems to be roughly the average. If someone becomes a Colonial Marine and about a month later they're in active combat, and in that month they're on Tangier Island, and there's Royal Marine, not just Royal Marine officers, but also individual Royal Marines are there, and it very much feels like, because again we're talking quite a small scale in many ways, some hundreds of people in a military landing force of only thousands of men. It feels like there was a lot of capacity for lots of one-to-one time, lots of continuous focused drill. And again, in this regard, we can't discount the motivation of the men involved in this. They're all volunteers. They're all formerly enslaved people. I can think of no better tonic to make you believe in and wish to fully engage in military training and military discipline than the transference from your previous position as an enslaved property to a military man whose freedom of action is limited by choice in order to do things that you really want to do to your former oppressors. This is I mean, again,
or just the opportunity to return as I don't know, a rescuer, right? If they go back to their plantation or what have you, and free their community, like all the people they've lived alongside and worked with, and aspects of their family too. Like
that's that's very correct, and is one of the, what I say, one of the quite magical elements of this story is again, I mean, I would go so far as to suggest that I suspect there was something of a quid pro quo approach, where if a young fit man capable of military service came to the British forces, they were more or less told, I suspect purely, they were more or less told that actually, you know, if you do sign up, we will go for your family specifically, because lots of Colonial Marines, their career path is individual escape, become Colonial Marine, and then there is almost immediately a raid led by them on the area they've escaped from. So, for example, in the various bits and bobs, you find individual Colonial Marines either by purely record terms. You have a person with a certain surname from a certain area, and 2-3 weeks after becoming a Colonial Marine, they raid that place. Then there's a dozen of that surname in the list of refugees. And in other cases, American slave owners after the war, when they were putting in compensation claims, they put in they wrote great narratives in order to demonstrate the truthfulness of their statements. They wrote great narratives about this young man disappeared, came back some weeks later, Brits in tow, takes away his wife and his kids and his parents and so on. And so on, yeah. So I mean that element again is I mean, to pick on a particularly charming example of this, in Maryland there was an enslaved man called William Dare, who was the slave of a Dr. Dare from that state. He, thanks to an American who observed this conversation and later provided it as evidence in a compensation claim, this Colonial Marine, William Dare, was going to go on a march, which eventually burnt down Washington, D.C., but he was given leave to exit the march with some others to go and find his family, who he were on a nearby plantation. And he had a conversation with a British officer in which the British officer forgot this and then was reminded of it and went, "Oh, yes, you're the man who's been given permission to go. Off you go." And William Dare rescued his wife, Nancy, and they eventually opened a pub in Nova Scotia called the Stag, and their surname by this point had been corrupted to Deer, so the Deers owned the Stag, which is
Okay.
very funny. But this is in the early 1830s. An American travel writer whose name I won't try to pronounce. It's a huge, long, very Dutch name. But this travel writer stayed at the Stag Inn and discovered they were Americans. They were escaped enslaved people, and he did he rather charmingly and kind of gracelessly asked, don't you regret it, because life here is obviously very tough. This hard scrabble life, on the edge of poverty in this little place compared to life as an enslaved person. And initially, quite charmingly, Nancy, the author didn't know this. I only know it because I'm a historian with multiple sources in front of me. But Nancy jokingly lies to him that she'd escaped first, and she'd escaped so quickly that William had to come after her. When in fact, we know that it was actually William who went and got her. So this author accidentally captured a very charming moment of her kind of teasing the husband who liberated her from lifelong slavery. But then she does this beautiful moment, which is recounted by this American quite brilliantly, where she muses on, oh yes, when I was in Maryland, I was a house servant, so it was all pretty dresses and easy living. Oh, but here in Canada, I don't work for other people. I work for myself. And at that point, William Dare, who's busy cooking, interrupts them to serve dinner, for ending that conversation. And that in the post-war accounts of formerly enslaved people, mainly in Canada but elsewhere as well, that refrain, I work for myself here, no matter how difficult their lives were, no matter how hard scrabble or low down their jobs were, that is a crucial element of their opinion of themselves as human beings, and the dignity of being your own person. It doesn't matter that it's a hard scrabble life here in Nova Scotia if we're doing it for ourselves.
I'm going to keep peppering you with questions. Chris is on mute, so I'm going to steal his.
Don't worry. I mean, the problem with this subject is there's so much. Much. You know what I mean?
And then maybe with our reenacting experiences, maybe we uncover some different aspects of it. How were they armed? Was it like the standard British Sea Service musket, or was it from captured stands of arms from the Americans that gave them muskets that they could equip the Colonial Marines with?
Again, it's a difficult one to tell. I suspect it was a bit of a mix. There is definitely at least one record where it's where captured French muskets are explicitly said to be given to the Colonial Marines. But that in itself is a debatable point, in the sense that they might mean French because lots of American muskets of this time were based on French designs with a slightly lower caliber.
I think I added that to one of your Twitter threads or a comment there, right? So that, because the British would call the American muskets French style muskets, so
exactly.
the Louisville pattern, even if they were done by Springfield or Harper's Ferry, or very much in a French style. And then the challenging part would be just different calibers. And we run into that with Canadian militias. If they were equipped with captured American stands of arms, then they had to really work hard to keep the ammunition distinct, because the larger British ball couldn't go into an American musket.
And I suspect a similar issue affected the Colonial Marines, but also because of the successful kind of raiding aspects of this, arming them from American stores, which the British force in the Chesapeake very frequently was able to get hold of, made sense on that ground, that rather than further complicate or further make difficult the supply situation for the fleet in the Chesapeake, let's use what we've got in front of us. Though an element of this, talking about equipment, is it from the very get-go, the Admiral Cochrane was very intent on the idea that they should be red-coated. They should be as near to Royal Marine equipped in appearance as possible, because of the propaganda value. Like, literally, he wrote, this would be an inducement for more people to come off to us. because again, it's one of these things that in kind of our context, in our modern context, it's hard to fathom the psychological distinction that would come over you if you'd previously been a field slave in the rough cotton one size fits all stuff of the era, to then move to having a uniform, and again the psychological effect that would bring on not only yourself but also on those observing you, who were very used to seeing you in a subservient role.
Any independent actions by the Colonial Marines, or were they always sort of detached with naval parties and Royal Marines?
Oh, entirely naval party Royal Marines, though within those actions they did occasionally operate in individual ways, as an individual group. So there was at least one small skirmish where an American militia unit made a defensive stand, and it was the Colonial Marines who bayonet charged and the only British casualties of the attack were 2 Colonial Marines who died in that bayonet charge, which broke that particular defense. There was also down in Georgia, there was a colonial, what I think was almost entirely Colonial Marine action, which fought against the American Regular Army's Rifle Brigade in the forests near there. That being notable because the Colonial Marines overcame the Americans so rapidly that their British officers struggled to reform and regain control of the unit, because they'd hunted the retreating Americans with such drive. And yeah, I mean, again, their impact on any individual action was this mix of the psychological factor, the terror factor, as it really was to the Americans, the information factor. So I mean, there's very frequent indications that when the Royal Navy were planning an operation, they would go to the Colonial Marines and say, who is from this area? You know, who knows the people of this area and who knows the layout? So, okay, so you're coming along both as part of the combat force, but also because you're the guy who knows the roads. And the Americans were very aware of this. The American Minuteman capacity to outfox British forces by local knowledge was completely undercut by this, because alongside the byways and highways, there was also, because of the nature of slave society culture, there is also a hidden network of paths, caches, hideouts known to enslaved people that kind of existed on the enslaved people grapevine, which British forces now had access to. So one Virginian militia officer, wrote that down in no compromising terms. It was basically impossible to outmaneuver a British force led by refugee blacks, as he called them, because we only know so much about this countryside compared to them, if you see what I mean.
Amazing. So 1814, as the year goes on, some global events kind of catch up with us. You have the abdication of Napoleon, the affairs wind down in Europe, and then a lot of would be Wellington's peninsular veterans get diverted to North America. So then you see this augmentation of forces in the Chesapeake, things like the March on Washington. Were the Colonial Marines part of that, or did they kind of get pushed in the shadow once you had the army there?
Now, this is a core point of my argument in my book, is that the March on Washington, in my opinion, was only possible because of the impact of the Colonial Marines. The arming of formerly enslaved people as part of the British forces, the raiding forces that were already there, exerted this psychological impact on the American ability to resist that undermined the entire capacity of the American military establishment in the region, because the American military establishment in the region is largely militia based. It becomes impossible to call out a militia when an individual man with his gun is afraid of leaving his farm for what might happen in his absence. And again, this leaps out of American reports. They're writing to the federal government saying we need more troops, we need federal support, because we are any day now a universal conflagration is going to happen. I.e., the slave uprising we've always feared is going to happen because we're losing control of the countryside day by day. And my argument is that when the reinforcements from Europe arrived, which were significantly less than was hoped, there was a hope for tens of thousands, and it was only thousands, because the British establishment still very much had its eyes on Europe and settling post-war Europe. When that reinforcement fleet arrived, General Ross, the famous Ross, was cautious about what he could do with this force, and to my mind, it leaps out of the primary sources. It was Admiral Cockburn in particular, who had been in the bay for most of the year so far and had been operating these raids with the Colonial Marines. It was him who said, "No, we have." What the word he used was, "We have such a ridiculous dominion over this region that we can land, march 30 miles inland and hit their capital city, and we can do that." And my argument is that the British forces felt we could do that because of the Colonial Marines' psychological impact on the whole region. The vast majority of the Northern Virginia and most of the Maryland around Washington D.C. was pacified. There's lots of great British reports. Everyone sat in their homes writing letters to me, a Royal Navy captain, asking if they can visit relatives. All their slaves are in our hands. We've got complete control. And then when the reinforcements arrived and the march on Washington was settled upon, the Colonial Marines, I suspect at this point about 100 or so Colonial Marines, which would have been the most long established, most trained, most experienced men then available, they were rolled into the light division of the army as it was organized. So if it was the 85th Light Infantry, the whole regiment was augmented by the light companies of all the other regiments in the force, plus the Colonial Marines. So they were the spear tip of the march, which moved in quite a zigzag fashion to confuse the Americans about its aims, until it pushed on to Washington. And again, a core argument of my book is, in my opinion, again, having bashed through all this stuff and read these sources and synthesized this stuff, when we went into the Battle of Bladensburg, which was the battle in front of Washington D.C., which was the one moment of significant American military resistance to the British operations in the Chesapeake, the Light Division, which included the Colonial Marines, very famously pushed across the bridge at Bladensburg, which should have been blocked by superior American firepower, but the American forces laid themselves out in a horrendously poor, free line, non-mutually supporting formation, dividing their artillery up. The Light Division pushed across this bridge and then into an orchard, which provided an amount of cover, and then they made contact with the American line. The Americans are mainly militia. They're just guys with guns who don't do this every day, and they crack. And the classic historical story is that the American militia line is hit by the British forces, and it's Peninsular War veterans, Napoleonic War veterans, versus guys with guns who don't do this. So the line breaks and collapses. My argument is the Light Division, at this point, when the Americans came into contact with it, wasn't just British Peninsula veterans, it was also armed African Americans. It was the living embodiment of the twin American fears, which is our republic is under threat from the empire we escaped from, and our republic is under threat by servile revolt from the people roughly half of the nation maintains as chattel. And in American writing about the battle, and that does appear. There was one particular American officer just states outright that the appearance of African Americans at the force at Bladensburg made everyone on the American side think, if that's in front of us, what's happening back home? Maybe the revolt has begun. I need to get out of here. And indeed, a further American officer very charmingly claims that one American senior officer, general, spent most of the run up to the battle banging on about the risks of a slave rebellion. I mean, we're all here in this field. We're not at home watching the slaves. What could, it could be a disaster. And in my opinion, that's the kind of chatter in an army, the information vacuum of an army on the march, that can drastically undermine your capacity to.
What was the name of the American general that was charged with the defense of Washington? Was it Winder?
Winder, yeah.
Yeah,
I,
so we just
absolutely the
this
single
past
best general you could pick if you wanted your
well
capital city to get knackered.
well this past weekend we had a reenactment for the Battle of Stony Creek, which was Upper
Oh,
Canada.
well, he got captured. Yeah.
Yeah, he was captured there, so he was fairly recently paroled to be able to, you know, so I guess you look at his CV, he's got quite the record there, right? Like,
It is again, trying not, I mean, yeah, not to be too terribly partisan about it, but man, we made a right call giving him back. He did a lot more damage. But like, I mean, there's a whole, again, it points to the partisan nature of American politics. General Winder was almost certainly put in charge of that army because he was the son of the governor of Maryland, who was broadly speaking anti-war and therefore anti-president. So President Madison made his son a senior commander to try and curry favor with him.
yeah, I'd have to go back and check my notes or past presentation. To give him a little positive credit, I think he was a key part of negotiating the exchange of prisoners. That helped wind the war down because the 41st Regiment had hundreds of soldiers in Kentucky, and their officers were in jail in Frankfort, Kentucky. There was all kinds of prisoners on both sides, right? American prisoners were floating in hulks in the St. Lawrence outside of Montreal and Quebec.
Yeah, we had a ton of them here on Dartmoor.
There was a revolt by American prisoner of wars just after the end of the War of 1812, because I don't think they thought they were being exchanged quickly enough or being sent home. So,
well, it's always the case, as I'm sure you're aware. Everyone forgets the difficult administrative and bureaucratic burden a war brings, even when it's over. And the human cost of that is it's understated. I mean, if I was to ever point anyone to an area of history that people should read more about, it's the immediate aftermath of wars and how it isn't just an automatic return to peaceful coexistence. There's this,
or
you have these,
it's the whole notion of families followed their soldier patriarchs into battle, right? So for the 41st, amongst the prisoners were all kinds of wives and children in the prison camps with them.
Well, of course. I mean, of course, then when Wellington's Peninsular Army was wound up in southern France, they left all their Spanish families behind.
Yeah, that's a horrible thing. All right, Chris, unmute. You get some questions in there.
Getting a little off topic here, but I'm trying to put these in some sort of order. But I guess the first one would be, generally speaking, what was the reception of these Colonial Marines into the Royal Navy? Were they universally welcomed? Was it a pretty mixed reception?
In the Chesapeake flotilla itself, the Chesapeake force, it was almost universally positive, with one or two exceptions. There was one officer who wrote privately that he thought it was a bad idea, and he made disparaging remarks about the supply requirement of having to look after all these refugees who aren't actively doing anything. Though it's important to note that the British offer, which was done in a proclamation put out by Admiral Cochrane, was no strings attached. It was, flee to us and we will settle you as free people elsewhere in the British Empire. You could join the military, but you didn't have to. There was no requirement. So these people who came to us and said, "You've offered freedom, give it," that was completely legitimate in terms of the offer we'd actually made to them. But then more widely and more positively, the inclusion of these African Americans in the British forces, it didn't remove the binary distinction between black and white. British commanders would very frequently refer positively to these soldiers, still using quite racially charged language and so on. And so on. And there's an undercurrent of what I can only describe as pleasant surprise that they're not incredibly violent at all times towards their former masters, you know, which is based in the kind of racial idea that black people are more violent than white people in a general sense. But then on top of that, there is very genuine, meaningful connection. Many years later, into the 1830s and 40s, there was lots of interesting retrospectives on this war written by people who'd served in it, in things like the United Services Journal and whatnot. And lots of them reflected heavily on the bravery and the patheticness of enslaved people. That, you know, the risks they would have to take in the meager situations they lived in order to gain freedom, deeply impressed soldiers and sailors in the flotilla, and created this kind of protective this mixture of camaraderie with those who became Marines, but also this protectiveness over the refugees themselves, which I think also became kind of the mission. Like, the mission was a terror mission. The mission was to burn American property and show them the error of their ways. But freeing people from a terrible slavery also became this kind of motivating force in the flotilla. So that, for example, right at the very end of the war, around literally just as the war ended, HMS Havana raided a farm and pulled a load of enslaved people out of it. But the war had technically been over for about 2 days at this point. You know, the paperwork had been signed in Washington, and it was all over. So the slave owner rowed out to HMS Havana and said, you know, the war ended X days ago. You stole these people outside that time. Give them back, because we're now at peace. And the captain of that ship refused, and wrote to the theatre commander that, you know, this is obviously a tricky legal question, but I'd like you to know that the ship's company have said they will pay everything they've got rather than give these women and children back. And that mindset again carries over down in Georgia, where the vast majority of the Colonial Marines were sent south to Georgia in late 1813, 1815. Down in Georgia, there was a Royal Marine officer called Andrew Kinsman, who very bureaucratically and very charmingly, when he was confronted by the American peace commissioners, again, because the war is now technically over, he's still signing up Georgian African Americans to the Colonial Marines, and they say, you need to pack that in because the war's over. And he goes, well, you know, my commanders haven't told me to do that, and I won't do it until someone gives me a written order to the contrary. And he keeps on signing people up. And likewise, various Royal Navy captains are accused by American peace commissioners of refusing to let them on board, so they can't do head counts of how many enslaved people are on the ships and things like this. And throughout the whole episode of the Colonial Marines, which includes all the areas they fought in, the Chesapeake, Georgia, and Florida, only a tiny number were left behind by the British forces, and the greatest number of people who were left behind was about 70 or 80 people, and that was because they were on an island which we occupied, which technically meant that the enslaved people on that island hadn't fled to us. They were there when we got there, and the Americans argued that this meant they had to be left behind. And I think partially because, you know, you can't immediately cause diplomatic incidents straight after a war, that was conceded. But then from that group who were left behind, maybe as many as 10 or something like that immediately then fled again to British forces and were taken away without the British forces raising any fuss over it. So I get a very strong impression that you could say that the British forces accidentally gained a moral high ground in the great debate about where slavery stands in democratic states, and they then became very unwilling to surrender it.
Yeah. I think I kind of know, based on what you've said, roughly the answer to this question. But as Canadians, there's always this fear. There's sometimes this notion that um, after the revolution and after the War of 1812, a lot of these escaped, formerly enslaved peoples reach Nova Scotia, reach New Brunswick, and there's just kind of this. And then the story ends and everything lived happily ever after. And we go, no, wait, sorry, no, from a Canadian perspective, it was actually quite awful still, right? And I know you said, yes, we've got our freedom, but there were incredible hardships. So did you follow up after the war? Like, did you follow any of the stories? I know you kind of mentioned some of these NCOs ending up in more administrative roles. So did you follow up a lot after the war with some of these soldiers?
Oh yes, and so in terms of the Nova Scotian example, is that there's unfortunately two elements to this. The Colonial Marines post-war life happens largely in two separate places. It happens in Nova Scotia in Canada, and in southern Trinidad, which is now part of Trinidad and Tobago. And this provides an illustrative example of the two different extremes that could be gained. In Nova Scotia, it would be fair to say that you had a mixture of neglect and indifference from the government and white citizenry about finding a place for these people. I mean, at least one of the Nova Scotian governors more or less openly indicated that what he hoped would happen with the African Americans was they would become a kind of seasonal worker underclass. So every summer when labor requirements are at their highest, we'd have this handy pile of unemployed lower class people to do work, and he tried to maneuver that community into that position. While on Trinidad, the vast majority of the Colonial Marines who remained Colonial Marines after the war, who didn't leave the service, they were demobilized as a group, several hundred strong, to Trinidad and given land as free farmers, and with the complete support of the colonial government in clearing a central region of the island, which was largely forested, to make a new life for themselves. And they generated a cohesive, quite insular community, which still exists today, which I'll talk about in a moment. While in the Canadian example, it was much more difficult to drag the necessary support out of the government, which had promised them the necessary encouragement to make a free life for themselves. Earl Bathurst in London at one point had to directly intercede with the Nova Scotian governor and say, actually, we did promise them X amount of support, so you have to do that, if you see what I mean. And so, I seen it. A lot of people eventually emigrated from Nova Scotia as well, but they were still able to build communities for themselves that did survive. But it was a much greater struggle. While down on Trinidad, as hard as it was turning virgin forest into farmland, the continuous support from the colonial government, which was partially based on the idea that this group had an intrinsic loyalty to Britain, which other communities on the island, because it had been under Spanish control and so on, might not have, meant that they became they had a much better time of it, if you see what I mean.
Interesting. Just jumping back a little bit, you did mention the risk, right? The incredible risk these people took. Do you know of any that were recaptured, re-enslaved? What was that was certainly part of the risk. Do you
Very
know,
much.
did that come up?
Yeah, once or a few times. There is a somewhere in Maryland, somewhere in southern Maryland, there is a very charming lighthouse, and that lighthouse is, besides being obviously a useful navigational aid, that lighthouse's only major impact on history is that a number, I think about a dozen African Americans who were on the way to British forces were intercepted successfully by a slave patrol in that area and killed. It's unclear if it was just men or women and children as well, but the number suggests to me it was probably family groups. And historically speaking, we can never truly know how many died due to interception by the various authorities. I mean, there's an irony here in that I mentioned kind of there was very limited real American military in the area. It was all militia based. The most well armed and most kind of motivated paramilitary force in this region at this point in history was slave patrols. And again, the other aspect we can't never know is lots of African Americans made it to the British fleet by sea, stealing boats, stealing canoes, making rafts, and so we'll never truly know how many didn't make it, how many drowned in the Chesapeake during their escape attempts. And talking of the exceptional courage and bravery required to take this risk, I said, it doesn't matter that we're making promises of freedom. We're a foreign force. We can say anything. Some African Americans who fled to us, including Colonial Marines, they actually went back into American territory undercover to organize mass escapes. And there was one particular instance where a Sergeant Johnson, who was of First Company, he went back into American territory undercover and returned to his plantation and told a happy minstrel song of the Brits are actually terrible. I'm coming back because it's better off here, which generally speaking slave owners were delighted to hear. So no questions asked. We prearranged a pickup with barges at a nearby river, and he was going to organize an escape. But his plan was blown, and he was picked up by the American militia, and he was almost certainly tortured to reveal his plan. And it's unclear what happened to him. Some believe he might have been hanged, but the problem in this context is an enslaved person is future labor. So generally speaking, you don't tend to kill slaves because that's labor, and labor value you're getting rid of. So he could have been shipped just deeper inland in Virginia. This was, and that and again, that there's indications that happened every now and again. People would attempt to escape, there would be recapture and say, well, you're a troublesome one, we'll sell you deeper inland, or it's still this retains its power well up to the American Civil War era. Being sold south, being sent to Georgia and eventually the states of Louisiana and Mississippi, where slavery was much more gulag-esque, was a threat used against enslaved people a lot. And another aspect of this that's worth pointing out is the standard understanding is that the person who escapes slavery is almost invariably a young man. In this campaign, because the British fleet is just in the bay, you see much larger numbers of elderly people and women and children running than you do at virtually any other time, until of course we reach the American Civil War era. And this is quite illustrative because it's a common kind of myth within slave societies that women and children don't run, old people are content, and so on. It indicates that actually no, when the opportunity for freedom, that it's a realistic opportunity. No one wants to die in a ditch being hunted by slave dogs. When it's a realistic opportunity, a lot more people took it, which indicates a level of agency and the willingness for freedom behind the population that was hidden a lot of the time because you can't escape, so you coexist with the horror, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of the numbers, can you give us an idea of how big did the Colonial Marine force grow, and how does that compare to the number that just escaped in general?
The Colonial Marines at their absolute maximum, including all the major parts of the unit, Chesapeake, Georgia, North Florida, I suspect reached about 1,000 people, 1,000 men almost entirely. Sorry, 1,000 men entirely. While the overall number of escapees from slavery is more difficult to quantify, but is generally regarded as 5,000 to 6,000. Though I suspect that's a bit of an underestimate, particularly in North Florida, where things are a lot more fluid. But the 5,000 to 6,000 seems to be about right. So generally speaking, 1 out of every 6 or 1 out of every 5, which is again a pretty good understanding of the proportion of men between the ages of 16 and 30, the kind of prime military age, became Colonial Marines. I mean, and although this is still a relatively small number of people in terms of the overall enslaved population of of even just Virginia, never mind the entire United States, this was the largest emancipation of African American people between the War of Independence and the end of the American Civil War. So this is also a significant moment in the history of African American emancipation, which is, again, it's hidden away under the cloak of the War of 1812. And because these African Americans then disappear into Afro-Canadian history and Afro-Caribbean history, their place in the emancipation of America is kind of hidden away in terms of wider history. Although the community in Trinidad, who I mentioned once or twice, they're very proud holders of this legacy, and they're to backtrack a little bit, the community in Trinidad, because of which is almost entirely Colonial Marines. I mean, it's all the first wave was all Colonial Marines who were demobilized in 1816, having been held on Bermuda as a force for that year. Their community still exists, and they're called the Americans, the Americans. They're all Virginia, well, not all of them, but the vast majority of them are like Virginia Baptists, so they stand out and they're regarded as an ethnic group on Trinidad. They have, I was speaking recently to the head of one of their community groups, because they're involved in changing the primary education syllabus of Trinidad to include this community in the story of Trinidad, because Trinidad's story is a slave colony owned by Spain and Britain and so on. But the American story is a very different tale, but they're still there, and they're still there, and they're deeply proud of their one way to see the legacy of the Colonial Marines is that the American community on Trinidad, besides the people of Haiti, they are the only African-derived group who fought and gained their freedom from slavery in their own terms. Yeah, it wasn't given to them by gradual change on the part of their authorities above them. It was grasped by them themselves. And you could say in terms of the War of 1812, British forces in the Chesapeake created the circumstances to allow this to happen, but we didn't induce it in ourselves. We didn't make a promise and then African Americans came to us. African Americans saw the chance of finding freedom in this clash between the British Empire and the United States, and by doing so, they made the British policy, which is a remarkable testament to what people's desire for freedom can bring.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Tom, although I do have one more question. I suspect he will cover this as well. But thank you so much. Like you say, this is an aspect of the War of 1812 that really needs more light and more attention. And so really appreciate you bringing this forward to us. Thank you.
No problem at all.
Tom.
Yeah, Matt, I'm going to ad-lib something. I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully I do this right. And then maybe talk us through some of the images. Some you had sent and some I had pulled. Okay. And that's a way we can wrap this up. So.
Well, mate. Well, Colonel Nichols there, we've only touched upon it briefly, which is the Colonial Marines in North Florida, which is another aspect of the war that's often forgotten about. Trying to do it briefly is hard because this is a complex situation. But what we've got in Florida is Spanish territory. So it's not part of the United States. It's not part of the British Empire. It's Spanish, but Spain is in an incredibly weak position because of all that's going on in Europe. So it's essentially a bit of a free-for-all. The United States is very gradually nibbling away at the edges of Spanish territory by a process what was often called filibustering, where essentially paramilitary forces would cause chaos in a region until that region requested support from the United States government, and the United States government would then take over administration of the region, which was what the filibusters wanted because they were American paramilitaries. And that was gradually eating away at parts of Florida. But also, at roughly the same time as the War of 1812, there had been the Creek War. So there'd been a civil war in the Creek Native American group between those Creek who had started to reconcile with American domination and in many ways in the American way of life, and then a revivalist movement partially inspired by Tecumseh. Tecumseh actually came south and met with the revivalist Creek, the Red Stick Creek as they became known. That war was Andrew Jackson fought against them and defeated the Creek, and the vast majority of the survivors fled into Spanish territory in North Florida, where by happenstance Colonel Nichols and a British military force were now arriving. And Colonel Nichols there, he had roughly the same orders as the Chesapeake mission. He was to arrive in the region, create a British base of operations, pull American attention from Canada by threatening Georgia and the recently purchased Louisiana. And he was to do that by making allies of the Native Americans, but also, again, to recruit and induce African American escape from slavery to create a military force. So alongside the Native Americans, who he was quite successful making friends with, but they always retained their own agency. They were never subordinate to British plans. They were always on par and having to be negotiated with. The Colonial Marines in Florida, which is what he also called his African American and also large numbers of Afro-Spanish from Spanish communities, the Colonial Marines, as he called them, they became the primary British military force on land in that area. And Nichols there, he made to these African Americans possibly one of the greatest emancipatory speeches by a white British person. He did this incredibly beautiful speech, which is in my book in full, but it included the absolutely magnificent lines, "You are already heroes, for you have dared to be free. And together we will unrivet the chains of thousands of people like you, and you will never again see your children taken away from you and the women you love taken away from you." He was a abolitionist to his core. He was part of the evangelical Protestant revivalism in English culture or British culture, which was an important driver of the abolition movement, and he deeply believed in all that, and he carried it with him on his military operation in North Florida. And he didn't really have the opportunity to do the great things he clearly wanted to do because the war wrapped up within a year of him kind of arriving and beginning his operations in Florida. But what he left behind in Florida, when British forces pulled out at the end of the War of 1812, the community he had built in North Florida, which was a mixture of the Native Americans and the escaped African American people, he offered the Colonial Marines the ability to come away with him to Bermuda or Jamaica or whatever, and a new future. And some hundreds did, but hundreds more remained behind with the Native American community. This is part of the ethnogenesis of the Seminole Native American group, which still exists today. And that community flew the Union Jack, and because he was unable to get British official support for this community, he tried very valiantly to get North Florida's Afro and Native American community recognized as a British protectorate, whatever the Spanish crown would think and whatever the Americans would think. But he was rebuffed in that. So instead, he just left them with a massive fortification, the largest man-made object outside of the two largest Spanish towns in Florida, tons of muskets, thousands of swords, and a couple of cannon and left them as a free community, which in late 1816, I think it was, sorry, mid-1816, the United States ended up sending a military force to snuff out, because the presence of a Afro-Native American community based around a modern fortification with modern weaponry, with a British drilled Praetorian military class, which was the former Colonial Marines, that was too great a risk to the American South. South, and it was General Andrew Jackson's operation to destroy this community was actually a military conspiracy, completely unsanctioned by the American central government. It was Andrew Jackson and some co-conspirators set it all up to create a situation where we had to destroy this community. Although there was no direct threat, it was purely a ideological threat against the slave society of, say, Georgia.
Wow. All right. Well, interesting. Hopefully the rest of the pictures don't draw that.
Oh, yes, sorry, yeah, well, yes. No, see, yeah, and this picture here is by a Floridian artist called Jackson Walker, and this is the community in North Florida became known as Negro Fort, because in American reports that's what it was called, because it was a fort held by black people. This picture by Jackson Walker depicts the moment when the American military force arrived to sadly snuff out this community. The African American and Native American people in that image, you can see on the right hand side on the screen, there's a Seminole or Creek Native American. The gentleman in red with the telescope and the slouch hat, he represents a former Colonial Marine called Garçon, and Garçon was the military commander of Negro Fort when British forces pulled out the area, and he it shows the level of military understanding here. And when the Americans arrived at the fort, they parleyed with it, and Garçon came out to speak to them, and with incredible dignity, and the kind of thing that makes my British heart swell to this day. He said to the Americans, to their horror, he said, "I've been left as the military commander of this fortification by the King of Great Britain, and I do not have any authority to surrender it," which ended the Americans' attempts to negotiate the return of this community to slavery, lifelong slavery for you, your children, forever. So, it wasn't really a negotiation. And after this encounter, the fort ran up its flagpole a Union Jack and a red flag, and the red flag is a naval symbol meaning no quarter. And in American writing about this incident, the no quarter flag shows what a savage enemy they were. They were willing to kill us all to defend themselves. And it's like, you've come to take them all back into lifelong slavery. It's already a no quarter battle, if you see what I mean.
Wow.
But an aspect of this, oh yes, yeah, and this leaping back to Trinidad, yeah, this is I believe in the 2019 Carnival, which is Trinidad's yearly celebration of its culture. This is the children of the American community, who are mainly down in Moruga in South Trinidad these days. You can find the legacy of the Colonial Marines on a map of Trinidad easily. If you go down to South Central Trinidad and look for an area around a town called Indian Walk, there's the town of 3rd Company and the town of 4th Company and 5th Company Primary School and 1st Company Road. And these are all the areas where the different companies of Colonial Marines were allotted land. And that's where the community lives to this day. And they remember their heritage as an African American and Afro-Caribbean group, as they now are, who fought for their freedom and were settled, as you can see on the flag, they were settled in 1816 on Trinidad, and I say they remain deeply proud of their heritage. And there is actually an intriguing and quite beautiful story in a way, in historical terms, how I discovered while doing my research there was actually a woman who was in the United States Marine Corps, and she was the children of Trinidadian immigrants back to the United States who went to the United States in the 1950s, and she fought for the United States in Iraq in 2003, and she discovered, after being wounded and while convalescing, she discovered that her heritage wasn't, as she suspected, one of Afro-Caribbean slavery, but she herself was descended from African Americans who'd fled and fought during the War of 1812 against the country which she now serves as a United States Marine.
Wow.
Which is a remarkable tale. I know this one here. This is from Ed Sufert,
Yes.
him and his group play Royal Marines in various War of 1812 events in the Maryland area, and as I frequently joke, they proudly maintain their loyalty to the crown / play the bad guys in these American events. And at one of these events, they had this gentleman, a volunteer, and they've done him up there in an approximation of how the Colonial Marines likely looked at the outset of the unit being set up. So what we've got there is a mixture of regular Royal Marine equipment, such as the top hat, but also Royal Navy equipment. He's wearing a belly box, which is a naval cartridge box designed for boarding actions, which implying this is the equipment we had available. In the early stages, this was probably the case. It was using the relatively limited supplies of the fleet in being to fit them out, but as time went on, they gradually became equally equipped as the Royal Marines they served alongside, and identical to. And so by the time they were disbanded in 1816, they were identical. Now this particular image is another good one. This is from the U.S. Naval Air Station Paxuant River, which is one of the many rivers off the Chesapeake which British forces raided up and down at various times. And this depicts that part of the history of the region. So you've got Royal Marines there burning American homes and also looting. And you can see there's various African Americans in there aiding with the looting. But this image doesn't include any Colonial Marines. And that's largely, I think, because the presence of the Colonial Marines in our operations has been very talked down in American history. And when this aspect of the war is depicted, there is still a bit of a habit of depicting enslaved people as if they are themselves property that was potable and moved around, if you see what I mean. Like there's in the American compensation documentation from after the war, no one escaped. Everyone was carried off by British forces, if you see what I mean, as if we picked up individual people and took them away, like we would a piece of silverware. So this image, I think, treads a pretty smooth line, and you've clearly got African Americans helping us, but it doesn't fully give them the agency of actively desiring to help us, if you see what I mean. Which again, I think is a bit of caution on American part not to draw too much attention to this interesting aspect of it. And now that final image, that's by Don Troiani, who I've probably pronounced wrongly. He's a well-known American historical artist. He's got a very good book coming out about the presence of African American or Black people in general in American military history, coming out right now. I think this image is included in it. And that's a Colonial Marine as they would have appeared at the point they were disbanded in 1816. After the War of 1812, they were maintained as a military unit on Bermuda well into 1816 as kind of a force in readiness. Like if the situation went south with the United States again, we would immediately rock back in with a fleet on their coasts with these armed African Americans ready to cause all the same problems over again. But by 1816, the situation had began cooling, so they were disbanded. But at the point of disbanding, they were They were completely undistinguishable from the standard Royal Marines of the era, apart from, of course, being an interesting military unit plus community, because alongside the several hundred men still in the unit, there was, again, a few hundred civilians, women, children. In at least one case, a Colonial Marines' parents were still around the unit. And this is another one. The island we occupied off the coast of Georgia was the relatively large island of Cumberland Island, and Cumberland Island gives you an idea of how by late 1814 our ambitions against the United States had become much greater. Cumberland Island is very big compared to, say, Tangier Island, and is only a mile off the coast of Georgia. So it was occupied as clearly a forward staging area for a much larger series of operations onto mainland Florida, mainland Georgia. This Colonial Marine, which is a replica uniform again, just the complete kit of a standard Royal Marine of the area, just using a black mannequin, is in the Cumberland Island Museum, which is in St. Mary's, which is a town that British forces based on Cumberland Island destroyed during the War of 1812. Compared to the Chesapeake, I think I calculated that British forces were only in Georgia for a couple of months, but it was something like 30 enslaved people a day made it to British forces for every single day that British forces were present off the coast of Georgia. The enslaved population of Georgia, for a variety of reasons, was in a much better position to run. And it's my contention in my book that if the war had continued into 1815, a larger British military operation in Georgia would have been much closer to instigating a servile revolt within the slave state of Georgia than anywhere else in our operations. And indeed, as an intriguing note, the British force on Cumberland Island at the end of the war was by a little bit, it was majority black. There was some hundreds Royal Marines, there was some 100 Colonial Marines, and then some 100 West Indies regiments. So the British army, ready to invade a state where something like 30 or 40% of the population was enslaved, was majority black, which would have had a remarkable. I make a strong argument for in my book, and I'll happily do it any day. An operation into Georgia in 1815, say an attack on the state's capital, Savannah, in the same format as our march on DC, would have been a much more enslaved people heavy event. And this final, I'm not sure if it is the final one, sorry, but this image is by Jason Askew, who's a historical artist of some note. He's got plenty of artwork up in various regimental museums here in the United Kingdom. He's a lovely South African man. He's also done work for the US Embassy in London, actually, to commemorate Juneteenth, the final emancipation of African Americans. He did this painting based on my book after we had a charming discussion about it. And this is the Colonial Marines going into action, maybe at Bladensburg, maybe in some raid. It kind of just evokes them as a unit in action, and it depicts them fully equipped as Royal Marines, which again is a bit of a debatable point, but is all, you can't prove a negative as of yet. So they could very easily have been this well equipped by the point of Bladensburg.
This is the last one.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, that's a very good one to end on, because that's the front cover of my book, of which I'm deeply proud. I will talk about the design elements of this book because I'm quite fond of them, and this is also an amazing tribute to the art of dust jacket designers when dealing with the terrible MS Paint stuff that I send them to give an idea of what I want. That's Don Trione's Colonial Marine there. But the flag in the top left is the Trinidad and Tobago flag. It's a flag because it's a modern flag designed post independence of Trinidad and Tobago in the 20th century. So it's not a flag you would commonly see on a Napoleonic era history book, which is why I felt it was necessary to have it on there, because this is very much linked to the modern the modern people of Trinidad and Tobago, the Americans who are descended from these men. And also the United States flag in the bottom corner is the era appropriate flag with the appropriate number of stars for the War of 1812, creating a nice anachronistic combo across the whole thing.
All right. Well, I have it on pre-order. I'm looking forward to getting my copy, and I know Ed's been sending me screenshots of pages in his. It's already well done. So he said I'll really enjoy it. So.
Oh, super! I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased. I must admit, there's been one of the real joys of this has been discovering the desire amongst very much the reenactor community to know more about these kind of unplumbed depths of the wars which they're interested in. I mean, I'm having quite a bit of fun talking to black historians here in the United Kingdom, because yeah, as in most of the Western world we're wrestling much more openly and wonderfully with these difficult and what we sometimes call here in Britain the contested narratives of our history, and having just more factual information to fill out the imagery of our past does so much, and the reception of so many people to it is so wonderful. It's very it's for I say I'm not a professional historian. I did this because I did this because I was seized by this almost righteous upset that
Well,
this story wasn't well known.
Just through our conversation, not just this topic, but the War of 1812 in general, you're incredibly well versed. So, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much, and sorry for keeping you so late, but
No problem. Happy
we
to do it.
could have kept you going for another hour or two, right? So
that's my curse. That's my curse. As anyone who's out to watch me do this on stage can tell you.
well, it's nice to have this forum where we weren't time constrained. So once again, thank you, Matthew. Really, really appreciate your support.
No, thank you very much indeed.